leave that door open for a little bit, because I know at least 2 or 3 more people who are trying to get in before we close it. Let's go ahead and start.
Dear Heavenly Father God, just want to thank you for this glorious morning. Thank you for being our God, for being our Father. Just thank you for your gathering us here today to worship you. Just pray that through this class that you will really be able to speak to us, that we will be able to feel your presence here today. And just bless Kenny's lips as he speaks, and just pray that we will be able to apply what we learned today to our daily lives. In Jesus' holy and precious name we pray.
So this is going to be interesting, for me at least. It's not working yet. And the reason is that Job is a unusual book. It's not like any other book in the Bible. You know what? Turning the power switch on probably will make a difference. There we go. Now, if you've sat in a class that I've taught before, you already know by far my worst fault. I had a friend years ago, an honest friend, who told me, he said, Kenny, if a man's thirsty, it doesn't do him a lot of good for you to put his head in the Niagara Falls. And what I ordinarily do is I put way too much stuff in, and then I try to rush to finish it all. So I am simply not going to rush over the next 8 weeks. And if we don't get to the end, we'll just push it to the next week, and we won't worry about it. So I'm going to make myself talk more slowly, but also this is that's just a place for me to start. It'll probably change every week. And if there's something that you see or something that you want to talk about or something, there's lots of room for disagreement on Job. And I have things to say that I think are well-founded. Well-founded is not the same thing as absolutely true. So jump in whenever you want, and if you take the class a different direction than the direction that the PowerPoint is laid out, that is not going to distress me at all. This is not one of Paul's letters where we can do a decent job of nailing down what Paul was trying to say, and where we can say this is a misinterpretation and that's not Job. Job's not that kind of thing. And I'm not saying that you can just read it irresponsibly and just read whatever you want to read into it, but there's plenty of room for everyone in this room to find something different. And I've always liked what C.S. Lewis, one thing C.S. Lewis said about heaven and about our individuality is that there's some aspect of God that each one of you can see that nobody else can see, and one of the things that eternity gives us is a chance for everybody to share with everyone else what they've seen that no one else can see without them. Job is much more like that than the epistle to Philemon, for example. So we're just not going to be in a hurry. Also, one of the most important people in the book of Job, the person that we're actually talking to most of the time when we're interacting with the book, is not Job. It's the person who wrote the book, who is a master storyteller, and the only thing that we know about him is that he wrote the book of Job, and that he was an Israelite living sometime in the 400 or 500 years before they got taken into captivity. And that's it. And I'm going to get very, very tired of saying the author of Job, the author of Job, the author of Job. So we're going to give him a name, which for my own personal reasons that aren't worth explaining, his name is now Jethro, So Jethro will be the author of Job for purposes of this class. If you looked in the bulletin, that's probably what you saw. The main thing about it is just that there are two basic questions that you look at when you come to Job. And the first one is, what did Jethro, what did the original author, he was trying to say something, he was maybe trying to say 30 or 40 different things, but what was he trying to say, given that he didn't have us in mind when he wrote this book? But he told this story, which he tells very carefully, and he tells in a very structured way. When he decided to tell this story, the people he had in mind were not us. So the first question is, what was he trying to say to the people that he originally wrote the book for? But then the second is, what is God trying to say to us? And we have a great many advantages over Jethro, one of which is we know of the resurrection, and we'll talk about toward the end of the class today some of there's a really serious intellectual and emotional and presuppositional gulf between us and Jethro. He was not a Christian. He wasn't even a Jew. He was an Israelite. There is a major change that happens in the way the Jewish nation interacts with God and deals with God that happens at the Babylonian captivity. Jews coming back from captivity or staying in Babylon, the majority of Jews stayed in Babylon, they didn't come back. The Babylonian Talmud is as authoritative as the Jerusalem Talmud, because so many Jews never came back. But the way that they interact with God, Rabbinic Judaism is a very different thing from Israelite worship. Job wasn't even a Jew, he was an Israelite. No, Job wasn't, neither was Jethro. Right? So we don't want to leave it where Jethro left it, because we've learned a lot since. But we do want to start there. We want to make sure, well, we don't want anybody who writes imaginative literature, I'm sure, has stories like this. My sister, years ago, won a poetry contest, and she went to the awards banquet, and when they got to her poetry, she had won for short lyric poetry or something. So they read her poem, and then the person who was giving the award, before he called her up, he spent about 2 minutes talking about why it was a great poem and how powerfully it expressed the suicidal longings of the author. And by the time it was through, my sister was so furious she almost refused to accept the award. Because, and she still gets, if you ask her about it, she still gets hot about it today. And you can just see her say, what poem was he reading? Well, we do not want to come up with answers from Job that would make Jethro say, where did you get that? Right? Like when you're talking to your teenage kids, those of you who have teenage kids, you're talking to your teenage kids, and you tell them something, and then you hear them later on saying what you said, and I never said, well, what? Where does that go? Well, we don't want to do that. Right? So you want to be clear with where he starts, but we don't want to stay there. Now, the thing that makes Job challenging, the thing that makes Job just not like any other book of Scripture, has to do with the ways of making the point. So if Paul wants to tell us not to be ambitious, he will write a letter and he will say, don't be ambitious. Right? It's very straightforward, it's very clear, and sort of prosaic. In order for Paul to be powerful, he almost has to be stirred up in anger about something, because the form that he takes of writing letters, it's very straightforward and very clear, but not necessarily very powerful. If, however, Shakespeare wants to say something about ambition, if you go watch Macbeth, it's not like Shakespeare, before the play started, walked out onto the stage of the Globe and said, now listen, just to make sure you understand, I think ambition is a very bad thing, and it not only messes up the people that you kill, but it ultimately destroys you too. I'll be good on that. You know, Shakespeare doesn't tell you his points. He shows them to you. He shows you Lady Macbeth sleepwalking, eternally washing her hands because she can't get the blood off. Right? And the power of what Shakespeare does is overwhelming. It is a vastly more powerful thing. However, it's also a lot easier to watch Shakespeare and come away with what you want to say rather than what Shakespeare wants to say. Right? You have to work harder to get the point. And that's especially true if instead of watching the play, which is what Shakespeare intended, you read it. And the book of Job was not originally intended to be read. It was performed. It wasn't performed on the stage, but it was told. Like Homer reciting the Iliad. But it wasn't originally meant to be read. And so, in order to do it justice, there are going to be moments probably where you feel like you're there. There are going to be moments when you feel like you're not in the Sunday school class so much as in the theater class. But not very many of them, but a few of them. Just because you just have to treat Job differently in that respect. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how not to hear a story. I deliberately picked examples that I thought were from subcultures where most of the people in here wouldn't meet it. And the reason is, it's much easier to see how people are being stupid if you start off by disagreeing with them. But the point of these two examples is to say, now we can see what they're doing. How do we make sure that we don't do that when we come to Job? Because there's a couple of different ways to mess it up. Some of you have heard me tell this story. At least one of you has heard me tell it approximately 500 times. I will stop addressing, poor Mary is here, she's my daughter, and I'm just going to have to not pick on her the whole time. So I'll stop doing that. When I was 8 years old, I grew up in the mountains in southeast Oklahoma, and I went to a hard-shell Southern Baptist church, which I don't know if any of you have any experience with hard-shell Southern Baptist churches. King James Version was dictated by God, alcohol was the nectar of Satan and so forth. And I had a Sunday school teacher who had the task of teaching us the story of the wedding at Cana one week. And I want to make sure that you understand, he looks really stupid in this story. He was a really nice guy. I like him. That's one of the reasons I'm not using his name. But he made an idiot of himself over this story. Now, the wedding at Cana, obviously, Jesus shows up at the wedding. He brings his disciples with him. And the people at the wedding have not anticipated, they've underestimated how many guests there were going to be and how much wine they were going to drink. And there's a decent chance that part of the reason was because Jesus brought a bunch of disciples with him. But at any rate, they run out of wine, so Jesus turns 70 gallons of water into wine, and we have this speech where the head caterer gives the bridegroom a hard time about saving the best wine for last, and everyone knows it's not the smart way to do it. Now, we read that chapter, and the problem is, this was a hard-shell Southern Baptist church. And all the people in that church had grown up in the Prohibition tradition, where it's not just that drunkenness was evil. It's that if you went to Olive Garden and you got, the tour of Italy and you got a nice glass of Chianti to go with it, you were putting your immortal soul in peril. They believed that God hated alcohol, which obviously makes it a little bit of a challenge to do the wedding at Cana. And so He finished reading the story, and then he looks up from his Bible and he says, "Now, boys, I want y'all to understand something. When Jesus turned that water into wine, it didn't have no alcohol in it. We know it didn't have no alcohol in it. Couldn't possibly have had no alcohol in it because it didn't have time to ferment. And I was 8 years old, and I was being respectful, and I didn't say anything, but I was thinking, well, that's really stupid, right? But he was completely serious, and it didn't seem stupid to him at all to think that Jesus could miraculously turn water into grape juice, but he needed time to add alcohol, right? Now, the question I've got for you is, why couldn't he hear that story? I mean, if you ever want some fun, you can read that story and take out wine and substitute grape juice every time that the Bible says wine, and especially the conversation with the head caterer, right? You're supposed to serve the good grape juice first, and then when everyone's had plenty of grape juice to drink and they can't tell the difference anymore, then you serve the bad grape juice. He can't hear the story. Why not? This is a question you have to answer, or at least try. Why couldn't he hear the story?
He's turned to 0.
His ears were turned off. That's right. Why?
He had his own preconceived notions about how things should be.
That's right. So I described him as being stupid a minute ago and said that he felt like Jesus could turn water into grape juice, but needed time to add alcohol. Is that really a fair way to describe it? No. You're right, it isn't. What is it that he really thought? It is a preconceived notion. He knew that Jesus would never put alcohol in anything. It's not that he didn't believe that Jesus could miraculously add alcohol without having time to ferment. He just knew that God hated alcohol and that Jesus would never create alcohol. And therefore, the only way for wine that Jesus created to have alcohol in it would be for you to leave it alone for 5 or 6 weeks and let it get ruined by fermenting. Do you see? Now, he was convinced that he knew that the Bible said that alcohol was the nectar of Satan. And so he couldn't hear the story because exactly right, he had his assumptions. Now, when we get to Job, the problem that we're going to have, the problem we have to look out for when we get to Job is that there's probably nobody in this classroom who has not already had to struggle with why God lets bad stuff happen to people we like. And that is not an academic question. For some of us, if you get to college, even if you haven't had relatives who've gone through bad stuff, then you've been challenged by atheists who love this argument. But still, this goes to something really fundamental about us, and we all have worked out to some degree of articulation our own position about what God's doing with suffering. Now, Jethro's answer, by the way, for those of you who came in, Jethro is the name we have given to the person who wrote the book of Job, just so we don't have to keep saying the author of Job, the author of Job. Jethro's answer isn't necessarily going to be ours. He was not a Christian. And furthermore, the people he was interacting with were not 20th century Americans. He certainly had never met an atheist. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that when we read any kind of scripture, right, it's the difference between exegesis or eisegesis, basically, okay? It basically is that, are you trying to substantiate, some kind of a notion that you've already established before?
Exactly.
Or you're looking at the text and allowing that to kind of, judge your interpretation, okay? And I think that becomes difficult. I think that anybody who tries to be objective, I think it's very hard, right? We do live in the 20th century. We do live in America. We live in, a certain socioeconomic. So we have to come in there, I think, with sort of kind of humbleness in the sense that, you know, we may not have the corner necessarily on the truth. I think that that's number one. And I think that the other issue, I think, with that is exactly what you're saying. I just think that, you know, we try to do this, what's called hermeneutics, right? As we kind of go from where we are to, like, going back to, you know, that there needs to be a certain kind of understanding of how to do that. And I'm sure that you're going to go through that. But anyways, but I just think that in this particular case with Job, I think that we have, like you said, it may be one of the oldest books
Mm-hmm.
in all of the Old Testament, in the whole Bible.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it goes back so far.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I think that in this particular case, it becomes that much more important. You know, so.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right. Next example is, this is someone who also has a story that she can't read, but her reason's a little bit different from my old Sunday school teacher. This is her take on Mulan, the Ballad of Mulan, which is not the movie. This is the original ballad from about 400 or 500 AD. And that original ballad, which is only about 150 lines. Oh, and here's, she has helpful stuff too. I'm not saying she's stupid. She's just got a blind spot, just like Mike Deacon had a blind spot, right? So, fair, interest of fairness there. The original ballad, it's only 150 lines. Mulan is the oldest of 3 kids. She has a brother, but he's still too young when the war starts. So with her, she suggests to her parents, and it's a family plan, she goes off to war, she fights for 12 years. She is successful, the war ends, and she is given the option to stay in the emperor's service, but she says, all I want is a 10,000-mile camel. All I want is a camel that's as fast as they come so I can get home. And at the end of it, I opened the door of my bedroom to the east, sat on my bed in the room to the west, took off my battle robe, put on my old dress. Facing the window, I combed my hair into the cloud hairstyle, and hanging up my mirror, applied makeup to my face. The first thing that she does when she gets home is she gets out of the battle clothes and she goes back to being a girl, and her relief is palpable. And this is the first place, by the way, in the story. It's 5 lines from the end of the poem is the first place that you find out that she disguised herself as a man. In the poem, you know, as opposed to the Disney movie. Now, it's not actually that difficult to see why this poem was powerful. It is a story of extreme self-sacrifice for people that you love, and yet it has a happy ending. So it's a very beloved story, because you don't get many of those, right? Self-sacrifice for people you love is one of the universal themes, but usually those stories don't have a happy ending. So, very powerful story, but the author goes out of his way to emphasize the fact that Mulan has absolutely no ambitions to be a soldier, that she liked being a woman, and that it was a sacrifice for her to spend 12 years not being able to do that. It's a very lovely little short poem and very straightforward. Now here is, that, by the way, Lan Dong is professor of English at Amherst University. So this is her take. Mulan's first appearance in the ballad conforms to the gender division of labor in ancient China. In the case of Mulan, an unmarried maiden returning to her life as a daughter is essential to balance her transgression of defying the social norms and to assure her future of becoming a wife and mother. Disarming the Amazon is a necessary denouement for the heroine to become an appreciated warrior without activating the alarms of a social revolution. And she goes on like this for pages and pages and pages. And the word cross-dressing shows up in this book, I would estimate conservatively 500 times. And you get through reading it and you find yourself wondering, what poem did she read? You know, that what she incessantly talks about is Mulan's, escaping the prescribed space for women and so forth. Now the problem is, it's fine for her to be interested in that, but that's clearly not what the poem's about. All right? It is what a later book that she analyzes, that uses the story, the Woman Warrior, it is what that's about, but that book was written by a 20th century Chinese American feminist who is actually interested in these issues. So, why can't Lan Dong read Mulan Ce? Why can't she read the story that's there?
She projected like what she knows here back to.
That's right. She has the kind of story that she's interested in. She has the issues that she cares about, the questions that really bother her. And she looks at the story of Mulan, and part of it, I think, is that the first time she heard of Mulan is in The Woman Warrior, and then she projects it back. But she goes back, she finds the ballad, and she sees a girl who starts off weaving and doing a traditional female role, and then she gets to go be a warrior for 12 years, and she escapes, right? In other words, because Dong's interest is in gender roles and social revolution and everything else, that's what she sees in that story, even though it isn't actually there. Right? If you asked Mulan what her basic problem was, Mulan would not say, well, the problem is that the gender norms of my society don't allow me to go fight without disguising myself as a man. What Mulan would say is, my problem is I don't have an older brother. Right? Now, when we come to, I left the point out. When we come to Job, we have our own concerns and the arguments that we have had about suffering and the questions that we want answered about suffering. And one of the most common ways in which we misinterpret the Bible is we go to the Bible and we have a question that we really want the answer for. And we go into the Bible looking for the answer to that question. And the problem is, if that's not actually a question that God thought was important enough to answer in the Bible, we'll find a place in Scripture and convince ourselves that it answers it. Okay? So, our preoccupation, and I'll tell you one right away, when we think of the problem of suffering, those of us who have been to college usually think of that as being related to the issue of atheism. Jethro has absolutely no interest in refuting atheism because he wouldn't have been able to imagine it. All right? We may, in the very last session, we may talk about modern issues with, how what Job says can be applied to modern apologetics. But he's not interested in what we think of as theodicy. It's not a question that he answers. Now, God has answers for that question, and when we say, how can we take his starting point and add more that we have learned because of the resurrection and all the additional revelation, right, from all the books that aren't among the oldest books, the Bible has stuff to say about it, but Job doesn't necessarily. And if we're busily listening, if we're looking in Job for the answers to the questions that we care about, it's easy to not even notice which questions it was that they cared about. And you have to make an effort of will to listen for their issues rather than looking for our own answers. And I specifically wanted to mention jargon. One of the things that's obvious when you read that passage that I put in is it's full of jargon that's only used by a particular subculture, and that in itself should be a hint that using that jargon to analyze a work of art that doesn't come from anything even remotely near the subculture that uses that jargon is probably going to give you bad results. So, what jargon are we likely to use when we come to Job? What sorts of words should we look out for when we talk about Job? What is our subculture? Put it that way. Everybody in this room most likely is what? Huh? Almost. All but three of us. Christian. If when we start talking about what happened to Job, how many people have heard Job described as a man of faith? Right? The word faith does not appear in the book of Job. Neither does the word grace. Okay? Job wasn't a Christian. And the New Testament gives us the Christian answer to the problem of suffering, and it's a very good answer. And it's going to be very easy for us when Jethro raises questions for us to say, I know that answer. It has to do with faith. It has to do with grace. And it is the answer, but it's not Job's answer, right? It's the answer that we're bringing in because Paul has educated us. And that's fine to bring it in, but first we want to hear what Jethro's answer was. And that means you need to avoid the New Testament words that we're used to thinking about God in. That make sense? All right, so to sort of sum up, if you're going to come honestly to Job, you got to make a distinction between us and the people that it was originally for, and you have to know how they were different from us, intellectually and emotionally, and you do your best. Henry's right. Our best is probably still not very good to try to go back and enter into that mindset, but we do the best, and I'll do what I can to sort of help you feel at least the major differences. You need to be sure to distinguish. Look, you have to bring your imagination to bear with this. You have to. You can't read this in a monotone. Okay? You need to be thinking about it in your mind. You need to be thinking about what tones of voice these people are using. The emotions are very raw throughout this book. These people are not sitting around talking in casual, rational tones as if they were, in a college dormitory discussing philosophy. But you need to be sure you're always aware of what's actually in the text and what you're filling in. You have to do some filling in. You just need to be aware that you're doing it. So you try to hear the original message first before we go on. And all of this has to do with being honest. This is all a matter of intellectual integrity and doing your job of being honest and faithful to the text. But that is not enough. It comes close to being enough if you're reading one of Paul's letters. But it is not remotely enough for Job. Look, how many of you well, I won't ask you to raise your hand, but if you've practiced meditation, and you have someone who's guiding you in how to do meditation, they'll tell you things like, say that you're going to meditate on the 23rd Psalm. So you take, He leadeth me beside the still waters. You close your eyes and you try to see it. You try to see the scene in your mind with the water. You listen for it. You listen to the sound the water makes, which is a trick, because it's still waters. The water's not making any noise. right? You hear the bees buzzing, you hear, and you bring all the senses into play to get yourself into the scene, to make it as real as you can. Because Scripture knowledge that sits in your head doesn't do you any good. It doesn't wind up affecting the way you act and the way you feel and the way you react. It has to be built into your heart. And that comes through the imagination. Well, even understanding Job involves the same sort of thing. You need to stage it in your mind as if you were directing the play or if you were going to act one of the roles. It's very... Think how boring it is for most high school students to read Shakespeare. And the reason that it's boring for them to read Shakespeare, number one, is that they wait until the night before and then they have to read the whole play in one sitting, which means there's absolutely no time whatsoever to sit and think about what tones of voice to read. In other words, they read a bunch of words. They don't see a play in their minds. If you're going to read a play as opposed to watch it, then you're going to have to do a bunch of the work that the stage guy would do for you if you were watching it instead of reading it. This is the same thing with Job. So you owe it to the author to start with what he was trying to say. But you owe it to yourself and to God to go further and try to say, now what does God want to say to me? And that's why the focus of this class is the way it is. So, in the time that we have left, however long it goes, these are some of the differences between ourselves and the Israelites. And I don't want to rush through them because I do want you to start imaginatively feeling the impact of these differences. Okay? First of all, by far the biggest difference is that we are post-resurrection. All right? And the Bible's, the New Testament's answer to all of the problems of human suffering and why bad things happen to good people and everything else, the New Testament's answer is Romans 8:18. And this is not the only place it says it, this is just the place that sums it up the best. I consider that our present sufferings are not worthy to be compared with the glory that will be revealed in us. Okay? To the ancient world, one of the distinguishing marks of Christians was their absolute willingness to die for their religion. There were people who had absolutely no fear of death. And the reason was Jesus had risen from the dead. He's going to raise us from the dead. And everything about the Christian life was oriented to all of the rewards that God is going to give us in heaven. And the answer to why are all these bad things happening to Paul is, henceforth there is stored up for me a crown. Right? Up until at least the Babylonian captivity, the Israelites appear to have had absolutely no conception of resurrection or heaven at all. There's a Hebrew word, Sheol, which is it's translated as the grave, usually, sometimes the pit. And now this is one of the places where I want to put a disclaimer in. I was a classicist, not a Hebraist, and so I have a little bit of distrust with myself on the concept of Sheol because it looks to me exactly like Hades, and I know about Hades because I was a classics major, and so I may be reading a little bit into this. So Sheol is a good thing for you guys to go look up on the internet and do a little bit of research. Again, you want to enter into their mindset as imaginatively as you can. But basically, concept of Sheol, you can see it in a couple of the Psalms, was that it was real close to being nothing at all. The dead were shades, they were shadows. And in particular, no matter whether you were a good person or a bad person, you seem to have pretty much gone to the same place. So God simply did not choose to reveal to the Israelites. This is one of the things, as you read the Old Testament, you can see God gradually unfolding His revelation, right? By the time you get to the time of Jesus, there's a raging debate amongst the Jews, between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, over whether there's a resurrection from the dead. And there is a debate as to whether there's a good part of Sheol and a bad part of Sheol, right? As far as we can tell, that debate didn't start before the Babylonian captivity. And it isn't that the Israelites pre-captivity disbelieved in the resurrection. It's that the question hadn't even crossed their mind. As far as we can tell, they just had no concept whatsoever of any sort of blessing that could attain to a person after they died. So the very first thing that you've got to get your mind, that you have to put yourself in imaginatively when you read about all these things happening to Job, is you have to get yourself in the mindset of someone who thinks, if he doesn't get rewarded in this life, he doesn't get rewarded at all. Now, we know that that's not true, but they didn't. So the New Testament's answer is not available to Jethro or his audience, and he is trying to make sense out of the fact that bad things happen to good people without having the knowledge that is fundamental to our answer. And I'd like for you to just try for about 30 seconds, I'll stop talking, and close your eyes, and just try to imagine what it would be like for you to not just not believe that there was a resurrection, but for it to not even be thinkable to you that there would be anything good that could happen to you once you were dead. And try to imagine that in the light of the best and kindest person you know suffering a painful death from cancer. And seriously, just close your eyes and just try to put yourself in that mindset with no heaven. How does that feel? So how did that feel?
Nothing to live for.
Why?
Nothing to live for.
Nothing to live for. Remember Paul saying, if only for this life we have hope in Jesus, we're the most miserable of people. This kind of leads me to the next thing, which is that the Israelites' experience of religion, you know how in the Old Testament, even with everything that God has done for the Israelites, they are constantly relapsing into idolatry. right? This is because their experience of religion was much closer to pagan religion than it was to Christianity. And their experience with religion was emotionally quite a bit different from ours. The ancient man, I'll skip back here. Ancient man had a whole bunch of stuff happening to him all the time. And you know, if you think about it, one thing that we like is we like explanations. And even if we don't like what happens, it makes us feel better if we know why it happened. Right? So ancient man had very little control over what happened to him. No technology that we would really recognize as such. And so ancient man was just buffeted about by nature. But not only could he not control it, if you had a tsunami hit, like the one that hit in Japan, one of the first things that happened here in the 21st century, the scientists immediately explained to us exactly where the ocean bed had split and how much force had come out of it and where that wave had come from, right? To ancient man, they wouldn't have had any idea of where to even start, imagining why all of a sudden the ocean rose up and swallowed the land and killed 100,000 people. Okay? It seemed self-evidently obvious to everybody except a few radical Greek thinkers starting in the 5th or 6th century. It seemed so obvious that no one would have even raised a question about it, that there were gods. But first of all, ancient man took their idea about the personality of gods from the personality of nature. And one thing that's obvious about nature is that nature is amoral and that nature does stuff to bad people as well as good people. And so one of the fundamental characteristics of idolatry is that there is no idea of any connection between being a morally good person and being on the good side of the gods. And in fact, a lot of ancient literature derives from good people accidentally making a god angry and being tormented by him for years and years. It drives the plot. That drives the plot of the Iliad. It drives the plot of the Aeneid. The ancient gods were immoral, and the point of religion was there was a bunch of stuff you couldn't control, and there were presumably beings who could control it. And so the idea was, ideally you would get them to be on your side and help you out, but if you couldn't do that, at the very least you wanted to keep them from being mad at you and actively persecuting you. Okay? Now, the reason that the Israelites were constantly relapsing back into idolatry is that even though the law of Moses introduces the revolutionary concept, and it's genuinely revolutionary. We don't perceive it because this is what we've always thought about God. It seems self-obvious. But the revolutionary concept that the way to stay on God's good side is to be a morally good person because God is righteous is there in the law of Moses. But the way you see the Israelites behaving and the basic attitude towards religion that underlies Job and that underlies all of the arguments that go on with Job, it underlies what Job's wife says, it underlies what his friend says, it ultimately underlies even what Job says. There's this fundamental attitude that the reason that you do what God says is so that He will treat you nicely in this life. And if you think about the fact that they had no concept of an afterlife, of eternal punishment or eternal reward, well, it's easy to see that's the natural thing for them to think. So if you are an Israelite, one of the things that you know from the Old Testament is that God's dealings with the nation of Israel as a whole followed their faithfulness and their unfaithfulness. But with individuals, even if the nation as a whole was being blessed, there would be an individual that had stuff going wrong, right? So if you have faithfully made the sacrifices at the temple of Jehovah in Jerusalem for the last 10 years, and for the last couple of years your harvests have been bad anyway, the automatic natural assumption of a pagan or most ancient Israelites is, well, I've made him mad somehow, and he's not paying attention to me anymore. Maybe a different God will help. Right? It's very difficult, it was very difficult to make the ancient Israelites feel like they had a deep obligation to be loyal to a God who wasn't coming through. Because that was the whole point of worshiping gods, was to have them come through. And this, when you're reading Job, his wife, his friends, and Job, if you look at their arguments, Job's wife is saying, it doesn't do any good, you might as well die. Job's friends are saying, it hasn't done any good, and God would be a bad person if he didn't come through, so you must be a sinner. And Job is saying, it hasn't done me any good, and I haven't sinned, so God has done me wrong. But they all start with this same basic assumption about religion that is radically different from what we learn as it goes through, radically different from David's love of God. These are not people who love God. They are in a business transaction with him. And we naturally think of entering into a business transaction with God as being a sort of inferior form of religion. They didn't think of it as being an inferior form of religion. That was obviously what religion was. Does that make sense? Now, the next thing is suffering in the time of Job. By the way, that clock is obviously not right. What time is it? 11:57. Okay, so it's just an hour off. So I can still watch the small end. All right. The first thing is they didn't have any anesthetics. The level of sheer physical pain that ancient man endured as a matter of course is very difficult for us to comprehend or imagine. It is tempting, it's not exactly fair, but it's tempting to say that modern Americans suffer less than any other people in history and complain about it more. It's not really fair, but it's tempting to say that, right? And part of it is that we're really good at being used to stuff. We're really good at getting used to stuff that doesn't change. And our subconscious does a pretty good job of just filtering stuff out. If you watch 10-year-old boys playing, right? When I was a kid, I would imagine that from the time I could walk until I was well into college, probably until I fell off a house and hurt my back and had to quit doing a bunch of the physical stuff I did. But I would imagine that there wouldn't have been any period in that time when you couldn't have found some place on my body that was beat up or scratched up, because I was always climbing trees, I was playing tackle football without pads, I was, and you watch boys playing and they'll be bleeding and they won't notice, right? Because it's been filtered out. They're focused on something else. Ancient man was a lot better at ignoring pain because they got way more practice at ignoring pain. And also, if you were weak, you died. And so they had some advantages over us in being able to endure pain, but it's outweighed by the sheer level of pain that they had to endure. And there also weren't any antibiotics. So sickness tended to kill you. Unless you were pretty strong. And this is also a very hard thing to get your mind wrapped around. Do you know when the first police force was invented? In London, police officers are still sometimes called peelers, because the police force was invented by Sir Robert Peel in the 1800s. Up until the 1800s, there weren't police. If you were going to be protected, you were going to have to protect yourself. And in the ancient world in particular, violence could happen pretty much any time. Now, if you think about a world in which there's a much higher level of violence than we have, and there's no anesthetics, you get people like Philip I, who in one of his early campaigns was hit in the eye by an arrow. And they dug the arrow out because it hadn't killed him. And he spent another 20 years politicking and fighting, and when he finally died, he was poisoned. He was assassinated. Can you imagine how much that hurt? Even in the Civil War, when people were wounded and they had to have their arms or legs amputated to save their lives, the arms or legs would be sawn off, and it was better for everybody if they just passed out from the pain. Right? Just the level of physical suffering that went on in the time of Job staggers our imagination. And so in that sense, their concerns about suffering were much more immediate and practical than most of ours. If we haven't had cancer in our family, or if we haven't had a car wreck, right, or some sort of tragedy, if you're in college, there's a very good chance that you've never had to go through something like the death of a younger sibling, right? Or your parents haven't died yet. It's quite possible to be 20, 21 years old in the United States and to have not had to deal with the sorts of tragedies and so forth that were absolutely common here. And so it's kind of easy for us to experience the problem of suffering initially as a philosophical problem. That the problem of suffering comes up for us, for a lot of us to begin with, in arguments with people who are telling us why we shouldn't be Christians. Or it comes up for us because we see one of our friends having to deal with a tragedy, and we would like to know what to say to them. But part of the problem with knowing what to say to them is we don't know how they feel. Okay? In the time of Job, if your best friend's little brother died, you almost certainly knew exactly how they felt, because you almost certainly had dead siblings. Infant mortality rates were 40 to 50%. Part of the problem with looking at life expectancy rates for the ancient world, you'll see something about the life expectancy rate being 41, 42 years, right? That's the life expectancy rate, including all the people who died before they were 5 years old. If you calculate a life expectancy rate for the people who made it to the age of 12, it gets quite a bit longer. It's still not 70 years, but it's quite a bit longer. And that, it just, for most people, it wasn't very likely that your first exposure to the problem of suffering would be trying to come up with an answer for somebody else's pain that you couldn't imagine. Almost certainly, your first wrestling with the problem of suffering would be trying to deal with suffering. And for some of us, that's the way it's happened for us. But for a whole bunch of us, the problem of suffering starts out as an academic problem. And if it's at all academic to you, you have got to get rid of that before you come to Job, because nobody in Job, in the book of Job's original audience, for nobody was suffering an academic question. Which is one of the reasons that the book of Job is not an academic treatise. Okay? It's one of the reasons that the book of Job isn't a piece of philosophy that lays out the logical answers to the question of how it's possible to reconcile the hypothetical justice of God with the apparent existence of unfair suffering, right? It's not laid out as an academic treatise or as a piece of philosophy. It's laid out as a drama and a story because there's nothing academic about it for that first audience. These are people who are wrestling every day with tragedy and suffering and pain. And the author of Job is wrestling along with it, especially because they don't have the Christian answer. So their suffering is much more real, much more personal, much more immediate, much more constant, and they have no good answer. That's what the author of Job is wrestling with, and that's what his audience is wrestling with. And one other small point. Those were the three main points. I actually have a little bit of time, so I'll tell you one more thing. I mentioned the infant mortality rates. Okay? In Ezekiel 18, it reads very bizarrely to us. God says to the Israelites, if you have a godly man and his son does evil, I'm going to punish the son, even though his father was a good man. But if there's an evil man, but his son repents and serves me and does what is right, I'm not going to punish him, even though his father is evil. To which everyone in this room says, well, duh, right? Do you happen to remember what the Israelites' response was when God told them that? Their answer was, that's not fair. The way of the Lord is unjust. They found that outrageously unfair. Do you know why? Why should a good and godly man have to see his children suffer? Why should a wicked man have the pleasure of seeing his children prosper? Right? The children were thought of, in this respect, the Israelite, and I try not to speak too much on behalf of Chinese culture for obvious reasons, but in this respect, the Israelite culture was much more like Chinese than American in that you were primarily defined within the terms of your family relationship. And children were primarily defined not first as individuals, but as children of some man and some woman. Okay? Now, take that, combine that with the fact that something close to half of all children died before they got to be 10 years old. And on top of that, there's no Social Security. There's no pension plans from your employer. Your only hope for being taken care of in your old age is to have children who survive to adulthood and can take care of you. Right? See, we think of when an old person dies, they're 85 years old, we're sad, we're going to miss them. But very few people say that an 85-year-old dying in his sleep is a tragedy. Okay? Because, you kind of expect them to die. But if a 4-year-old dies, so this is the tragedy scale, right? And this is age. The engineer in me is coming out. If a 4-year-old dies, we think that's a tragedy because children don't die, right? Children just don't die. Women don't die in childbirth, except in very rare circumstances, which we immediately label a tragedy. And and it's a tragedy because it's a violation of the natural order from the way we perceive it, right? So for us, it looks something like that. The older you get, we're still sorry to see you die, but the worst tragedy of all is a child dying. For the ancients, it looked much more like this. Okay? If you let yourself be emotionally destroyed every time a 2-year-old died, you would be insane by the time you were 20. Including your own. Look, countless women had 6 children die, and 2 or 3 make it to adulthood. A fairly significant number of women would have 7 or 8 children, and none of them would make it. Okay? Job, the beginning of the book, has how many children? Lots. He's got about 14, I think. I didn't even look this up, but I think it's 7 sons and 7 daughters. But he's got plenty, and they're all grown up because they go have dinners with each other, right? Probably the single biggest thing that made people look at Job and say, man, that guy is blessed, is he had 14 grown up children. When Job's children die, so that Satan can try to prove something about Job, we think that's outrageous, because why should they die to prove something about Job? The original audience wouldn't have been particularly disturbed about the idea of why would they die to prove something about Job. Children got punished for their father's sins. To Job's friends, the fact that Job's 14 sons and daughters had died wasn't proof that God was cruel to the sons and daughters, it was proof that Job was a sinner. So that part wouldn't have struck them. What would have struck them as absolutely appalling, as unthinkable, unimaginable, is for a person to have actually gotten to where they had 14 grown children. You're good, right? If you've got 14 grown children, if you manage to get 14 children out of childhood, you are set for your old age. What is horrific to Job's original audience is that he loses all at once 14 grown children. See, we would be shocked and appalled by the death of 14 3- and 4-year-olds. That audience would have taken in stride. But for someone to have managed to get 14 kids into adulthood and then lose them all in an instant was something very close to the most unthinkable of tragedies. That make sense? Any questions? Because we're just about done. That's contact information if you want. I've stopped putting my email address up because it spams so much I don't notice them. So I see text. Next week we're going to start. I'm happy because without feeling rushed, I managed to get the background stuff out of the way. All right. So next week we'll start digging a little bit more into the text of Job. Wouldn't hurt you to read it, but it's fairly long, so it'll make you. If you do read it, try very hard to read it, taking into account, try very hard not to read it as an academic exercise. Try very hard to read it without any thought of any sort of eternal reward the laws. Try very hard to read it with the sort of expectation, with the sort of feeling that, you know, well, if bad things are going to happen to a religious guy, what is the point? Remember, because there's no eternal reward, because there's neither an eternal reward or eternal punishment, there is no downside to turning your back on a God who's not going to bless you in this life anyway. What is the downside? There's not a hell. You wind up the same way. We know that's not true, but that's what they thought. So try to read it in that frame of mind. For one thing, it makes Job's complaints look a whole lot more reasonable than they tend to look to us. Okay? And when Job's friends are arguing and they're making their arguments, many of which look kind of stupid to us, they mostly look stupid to Christians. They make a whole lot more sense if you start with their assumptions. So try to read it starting with their assumptions. And if you have to, if you don't have time, you don't have time because we're all busy. But if you have time to try to read the book of Job before next week, in as much of an ancient Israelite frame as you can, that will probably do you a lot of good and make the next discussion better. So thank you very much for being here. Hey, Henry, can you close us in prayer?
Sure. God in heaven, as we approach your throne, we thank you for your word. And we thank you for its everlasting truths. That, Lord, as we struggle with this text, as we struggle with our own presuppositions and our own theology, that, Lord, that you would make that process be a very fruitful one. Lord, that we'd be able to learn more about yourself, learn more about who you are, learn more about the aspect of suffering, and hopefully as a result of the exercise, Lord, that not only would we be profited ourselves, but that, Lord, that we'd be able to perhaps understand some of the people around us as they're suffering, and just be more compassionate, and for us to be able to just impart a little bit of your love and your wisdom to the world around us. And we thank you for this time that we have to discuss these things.